Welcome to History Shot, your healthy dose of the past.
The bicycle, though seemingly simple in design, is actually a pretty impressive feat of human engineering. In the space of just a few short decades, it went from a novelty that was laughed at to being the most prolific vehicle on the planet. But who first came up with the idea? And what came before the modern bicycle? Let's take a look at the history of two-wheeled travel. The bicycle, defined as a two-wheeled vehicle that requires balancing by the rider, is a surprisingly recent invention, with the first verified iterations popping up at the start of the 19th century. Quick note here before we continue, there are claims of earlier inventions, but they have so far been unverified, so I'll be sticking to the most commonly cited version of events, whilst acknowledging here that there are other theories. Okay, back to it. Given that the wheel was estimated to be invented around 3500 BCE, it does seem a little odd that it would take so long for someone to come up with the idea. But it was also around this time that humans began domesticating wild horses, and this relationship was one that would last for a long time. Inventions tend to come about when we are seeking the solution to a problem, and the horse was the solution to many things, from transport to agriculture. And even when we did come up with a way to use the wheel in transportation, we still relied on horses to pull those contraptions around. So, what problem did the bicycle solve? Well, in the 1810s, Earth was struck with several large volcanic eruptions, which caused many weather changes across the planet. Most notably, a huge drop in temperature. Many countries struggled to feed their citizens as crops failed and food began to run out. Horses are very large animals, and they require a lot of food to keep them healthy. Food that many just didn't have to spare. So, unable to rely on horsepower to get around, we needed an alternative mode of transport. Enter Mr. Smarty Pants, Carl Friedrich Christian Ludwig Freiherr Drais von Sauerbrunn. And I'm sure I've just completely butchered that, so I'll just be calling him Carl from now on.
Hello there.
Carl was a German noble, and is often cited as the father of the bicycle. He was a keen inventor, and before his death in 1851, he had created an early stenograph machine and the first meat grinder, amongst other things. Anyway, looking for a way to get around that didn't rely on horses, Carl invented the first human-propelled two-wheeled vehicle, the Laufmaschine, and again, please forgive my terrible pronunciation. Carl's Laufmaschine, which means running machine in German, was called such because it required the rider to walk or run to propel it forward. Steering was controlled by a simple handlebar attached to the front wheel, and the frame was made from solid straight planks of wood. The wheels were made using brass and iron, and the whole machine weighed a whopping 48 pounds. The rigid design of Carl's invention meant that each one had to be made to fit their intended rider, as it being too tall or too short would make it almost impossible to use. The design soon found its way across Europe, and it wasn't long before alterations were being made to improve it. In England, a man by the name of Dennis Johnson made a new and improved version of the running machine, with a sleeker, serpentine frame, which allowed for larger wheels without having to raise the seat of the rider. This version used the French name for the original invention, the Velocipede, which I'm sure has something to do with velocity and feet, but it just makes me think about a velociraptor crossed with a millipede, so I think it's a pretty cool name. Sadly, this name fell out of use in England, and people began calling the Velocipede the hobby horse, after the children's toy of the same name. Even with this boring name switch, Johnson's design boomed in popularity in 1819. But the heavy wheels and unyielding frame made riding the hobby horse somewhat problematic, especially on the muddy and often battered roadways of the time. People quickly realised that pavements provided a much more suitable surface for riding, but it also led to many accidents, as the hobby horse's speed and weight made it difficult to dodge pedestrians. As a result of the many accidents caused by these new contraptions, many cities banned the use of hobby horses on public pathways, which led to a sharp decline in their use. Despite this, alterations were still being made to the design, including adjustable seats, which allowed the Velocipedes to be manufactured on a larger scale, as they no longer needed to be made to size and could instead simply be adjusted by the user. Between 1820 and 1850, many different designs were created, with varying success. It's also worth noting here that three-wheeled contraptions, or tricycles, had been used since as early as 1655, with at least one such invention involving the use of a crank-powered wheel. Using this knowledge, many manufacturers simply added another wheel to their design. There were several ways this extra wheel could be added, and even after doing this, some would take a look at their tricycles and think, hey, you know what would make this even better? Yep, another wheel. And so, sometime around 1853, the quadricycle was born. The extra wheels provided some much needed stability, but they were still really heavy and difficult to manoeuvre. Despite the setbacks and branching off, many inventors weren't quite ready to give up on two-wheeled travel just yet, and progress was being made bit by bit. There are varying reports of pedal-operated hobby horses during this time, but the oldest preserved example is the one belonging to a German man named Philipp Mortius Fischer. He created it in 1853, and it is still on display at a museum in his hometown. Having completed a carpentry apprenticeship and working as a piano maker, Philipp's knowledge of woodworking allowed him to create a beautiful yet functional pedal-powered velocipede. Philipp's invention was simply a modification he made to his own personal device, and it wasn't until the 1860s that a commercial version would be created. This version, made in France, used the same crank and shaft setup on the front wheel. The front wheel was made a bit bigger, and the seat was mounted atop a semi-flexible strip of metal, which made the ride slightly more comfortable. This new velocipede, while an improvement, still had problems. The pedals being attached to the same wheel being used to steer made controlling it difficult, especially when trying to turn. On top of this, the hard metal frame and iron-banded wheels made the ride uncomfortable, even with the springy seat. You have to remember, the roads being ridden on were mostly cobbled and poorly maintained, having been made for and used predominantly by horses and large carriages. In fact, the ride was so bumpy that this version was nicknamed the Boneshaker. Again, there are several theories as to who first created this model, but the earliest year generally agreed upon is 1864. The first company that mass-produced them was Michaud & Company, based in Paris. The company did extraordinarily well, selling their pedal-powered velocipedes with trademark serpentine-shaped frames. Unfortunately, over time, customers began to complain that the serpentine design of the frame would fail, as it was made up of two halves bolted together. And as more competition sprung up around them, Michaud & Company were forced to move to the stronger diagonal design being used elsewhere. For a few years, the Velocipede steadily grew in popularity, making it to the United States and Canada by the end of the century. However, owing to war and terrible roadways, this popularity was short-lived, and the Velocipede again fell out of favour in most places. In England, however, with some help from French inventors, the design was simply altered again. You probably know this type of bicycle as the Pennyfarthing. named after the English coins, but at the time, they were simply known as bicycles, the first two-wheeled machines to be called such. The front wheel of this bicycle was massive, which allowed the rider to pick up speed quickly, but came with many downsides. For one, just getting up to the seat could be difficult, often requiring the use of a small step at the back of the bike. And for two, the design was incredibly dangerous. The riders were often travelling on uneven roads, high up off the ground, with no real way to save themselves if the bike began to fall, as their knees were often jammed up underneath the handlebars. And with the increased speed provided by the giant wheel, serious injuries were not uncommon. This danger did limit their popularity, and in an attempt to make bicycles safer, and therefore more appealing to the general public, manufacturers set about modifying their designs once more. Chain-driven bicycles began appearing towards the end of the 1870s, and companies experimented with different sized wheels until finally, in 1885, the modern bicycle was born. Created by inventor John Kemp Starley and local cycling enthusiast William Sutton, the Rover safety bicycles set the new standard and saw huge success. In fact, this is the very same Rover company that created and gave name to the iconic Land Rover. Anyway, back to the bikes. They were called safety bicycles because they'd been designed with safety in mind. Some had specially shaped frames and chain guards with female riders and their dresses in mind. Others, like the Whippet, had a frame fitted with springs to add suspension. The chain powering the rear wheel made it much more manoeuvrable, and soon, manufacturers began using diamond-shaped frames and pneumatic tyres, which finally improved the rider's comfort. With these changes, the bicycle quickly grew in popularity, and by 1890 had almost completely replaced the pennyfarthing. And this is where people started to get really inventive and play with the design to fit their needs. Larger tyres to deal with rough roads? Check. Hand-operated brakes to make stopping easier? Check. Another seat? Or 4? Check. The next few years would see the introduction of gears and derailleur systems. Before this implementation, bikes were limited to 2 speeds, and changing between them required the rider to stop, remove their rear wheel, flip it around, and then refit it, which was less than ideal. The popularity of the bicycle only snowballed from here on out, and several militaries even had bicycle divisions. By the mid-20th century, most bikes in the United States were placed in one of 2 categories. Sports roadsters, which were mostly British imports with gears, hand-controlled brakes, lightweight frames, and thin, tall wheels, and cruiser bicycles. These bikes were much heavier than their counterparts, and were only single speed. However, the draw of these bikes was their unique style and array of accessories, from lights to saddlebags, and even built-in radios. From here, the focus shifted to specific types of bikes for specific types of activities. Think mountain bikes with their full suspension for use on rough terrain, or BMXs with their smaller frame to facilitate various tricks. Road bikes, cargo bikes, track bikes, and so on. Of course, the evolution of the bicycle hasn't stopped just yet, and in fact, there was another type evolving alongside the ones we've spoken about. The electric bike. First documented in the 1890s, electric bikes have sat in the shadow of their manual brethren for decades. Low battery life, slow charging time, and the heavy weight of the batteries made them impractical. And it wasn't until the turn of the century that we really began improving this technology. As batteries got better and better, so too did the electric bike, and they are only gaining more popularity as time goes on. While motorised travel eventually almost completely replaced horses as our mainstay of transport, the bicycle remains immensely popular in many countries, and is in fact, to this day, the most common type of vehicle in the world, and I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. Thanks for joining me on this journey through time. These videos take a super long time to make, so if you have watched this far, I would massively appreciate if you could help my channel grow by subscribing, commenting, and liking the video. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time.